Somewhere in a single old episode of The Simpsons, the most famous singer on the planet hid his real voice behind a fake name, and for almost 30 years, nobody could prove it was truly him. That is only the very beginning. The friendliest, most familiar cartoon in the world is quietly full of buried things, hidden voices, erased episodes, a stranger living under a dead man's name, a number that lined up with a terrible day, a lost film that never existed, yet millions swear is real, and a small handful of moments where the show seemed to stare straight into the future itself. Tonight, all of it gets laid out, slowly and carefully, the true separated from the fake, one strange true story at a time. Nothing here is invented to frighten anyone. The real ones are stranger than any ghost story ever could be. Welcome to Yellow Fan. Settle in, get comfortable, and let the strange, true history of Springfield itself slowly carry you off to sleep. The episode that got erased. In 1991, the most famous singer on the planet stepped into a recording booth and agreed to play a man who was not himself. He took almost no money for it. He asked, on purpose, to keep his name out of the credits. And for nearly 30 years after that, no one could say for sure that it had even happened. The show was The Simpsons, and back then it was still a baby. It had only been on the air since the end of 1989. By 1991, it was the biggest thing on television, and maybe the biggest thing on Earth that wasn't a real person. Bart Simpson was on t-shirts, lunchboxes, posters, and bed sheets. Kids said his catchphrases in school until teachers got sick of hearing them. The Yellow family had gone from a strange little cartoon to a full-blown craze in about 2 years. So when the third season was about to start, the people making the show wanted to open with something huge. They got it. They just couldn't tell anyone. The episode is called Stark Raving Dad, and it aired on September 19th, 1991 as the very first episode of season 3. The setup is simple, the way the best early Simpsons episodes always were. Bart accidentally washes one of his red hats in with all of Homer's white work shirts. Every shirt comes out bright pink. Homer has nothing else to wear, so he goes to the power plant in a pink shirt. His boss and the other workers decide a grown man wearing pink must be out of his mind. On top of that, Homer is handed a long form to check whether he is mentally healthy, and he fills it out in the laziest, most careless way possible. The result of all this is that Homer Simpson gets declared insane and shipped off to a mental hospital. Inside the hospital, Homer is put in a room with a very large man. The man is tall, heavy, and white, with a soft, gentle, high voice. And this man calmly explains that he is Michael Jackson, the real one, the king of pop. He says he checked himself in to get a break from his fame. Homer, being Homer, believes him completely and instantly. The two become friends. The big man brings a kind of peace to the whole hospital. He sings to the other patients and they calm down. When Homer is finally let out, he invites his new friend to come home and stay with the family. Word spreads through Springfield that Michael Jackson is coming to the Simpson house. A huge crowd gathers, but the man steps out and the crowd is confused because he does not look anything like Michael Jackson. The town turns angry and walks away feeling tricked. Meanwhile, Bart has a different problem. He forgot his little sister Lisa's birthday, and Lisa is heartbroken. So the big man helps Bart write Lisa a song to make up for it. Together they record a sweet, simple birthday tune for her called Happy Birthday Lisa. It works. Lisa is touched and the family is happy. Then comes the quiet twist at the very end. The big man admits the truth. His name is not Michael Jackson at all. His real name is Leon Kompowski, and he is a bricklayer from New Jersey. He has a deep, rough, ordinary voice, which he reveals in the final moments. He explains that for years he had been talking and singing like Michael Jackson because doing it made people around him feel good, and making people feel good made him feel good. Then he walks off down the road, speaking in his real voice, and the episode ends. Here is the part that turned a normal cartoon episode into a decades-long mystery. The soft, gentle voice of the man who believed he was Michael Jackson was performed by the actual Michael Jackson. He really did it. At the time, he was the most successful musician alive. He had sold tens of millions of records, and he agreed to come in and voice a guest character on a cartoon, partly because his own children loved the show, and partly because he thought it would be funny to play a fat white man who thinks he is Michael Jackson. But Jackson did not want anyone to know. He asked the producers to leave his name off the credits. In place of his real name, the credits listed a made-up name, John J. Smith. There was also a money reason hiding behind the joke. Jackson was signed to a record company, and that contract did not allow him to just sing on someone else's show when whenever he wanted. So for the actual singing parts, including the birthday song, the producers brought in a different performer named Kip Lennon, who could sound almost exactly like Jackson. The speaking voice was the true Michael Jackson. The singing voice was a talented copy. The two were blended together so smoothly that most people watching had no idea two different men were involved. For years, this created one of the strangest debates in television history. Fans would hear that voice and feel certain it was really him. Others said, no way, it was just a good impression, the kind of thing a cartoon does all the time. The people who made the show stayed quiet and coy about it. They would smile and dodge the question. Magazines and newspapers argued back and forth. Because the credits said John J. Smith, there was no official paper anywhere proving it had been the King of Pop. The whole thing floated in a gray area for almost 30 years, half rumor and half legend, the sort of campfire story that Simpsons fans passed around without ever being able to prove. It was finally settled in 2018 when the show's creator, Matt Groening, openly confirmed that yes, it truly had been Michael Jackson all along. He explained that Jackson had been a real fan and had asked to do it himself. So the legend turned out to be the truth. The biggest pop star of his generation had quietly sneaked into one episode of a cartoon hidden behind a fake name, and almost nobody had been allowed to know for sure. There is something quietly sad buried inside the story itself, and it is easy to miss because the episode is so funny. The character Leon Kompowski is a lonely man who feels invisible as himself. He is only happy and only able to make others happy when he stops being Leon and pretends to be someone famous and beloved. The moment he goes back to his own plain voice, the magic seems to fade and he walks away alone. A man who can only feel good by becoming somebody else is a heavy idea to slip into a half-hour comedy, and the show slipped it in without slowing down to point at it. The real-life timing of the episode makes it even stranger to look back on. In 1991, Michael Jackson was near the top of the world, beloved almost everywhere. The idea of him as a kind, calming figure who helps a sad little girl feel loved on her birthday matched the way most people saw him at the time. He played a gentle helper, and millions of families watched it and felt warm. For a whole generation of kids growing up in the early 90s, this was one more cozy Simpsons memory, even if they never realized the gentle voice belonged to the real Michael Jackson. That warm memory is exactly why what happened next feels so eerie. The episode that millions of people grew up with, the one with the hidden famous voice and the sweet birthday song, has now been wiped from almost everywhere. It is the closest thing The Simpsons has to a banned episode, and it was banned by the show's own creators. The reason came in 2019. A documentary called Leaving Neverland was released. In it, two men describes in painful detail claims that Michael Jackson had abused them when they were boys. The film brought old and serious accusations roaring back into public attention. After watching it, the people in charge of The Simpsons made a decision. The longtime producer James L. Brooks, the creator Matt Groening, and the showrunner Al Jean agreed together that the episode could not stay in circulation. Brooks said pulling it was clearly the only choice to make, even though he had loved the episode and treasured the memories tied to it. So Stark Raving Dad was removed. It was taken off streaming services. It was taken out of the show's reruns on television. It was scrubbed from new boxed sets. So people buying The Simpsons on disc today will not find it. An episode that had aired for almost 30 years, that opened a whole season, that hid one of the biggest secret performances in TV history, simply vanished from the official record, almost as if it had never been made. That is the part that makes it feel less like a normal piece of television and more like a ghost. A finished, beloved, famous episode exists, was watched by huge audiences for decades, and is now nearly impossible to see in any legal, official way. The voice that fans had argued about for 30 years was finally confirmed as real, and then, almost immediately, the whole thing was sealed away. The mystery of whether it was truly him was solved at almost the exact moment the episode became forbidden. This is the strange shape that so many Simpsons stories take, and it is the reason this video exists. From the outside, The Simpsons looks like the friendliest, silliest, most harmless thing in the world. It is a bright yellow cartoon about a clumsy dad and his pranking son. It has been background noise in living rooms for over 30 years. And yet, hiding right underneath that cheerful surface, there are secrets, accidents, dark turns, and disappearances that are every bit as odd and unsettling as any horror story made up on purpose. The episode with the hidden King of Pop is only the first of them, and it is one of the few that can be proven down to the smallest detail. What makes the show so haunting to dig into is that the strangest stories are usually usually the true ones. The hidden voice was real. The fake name in the credits was real. The 30-year argument was real. The sudden erasing of the whole episode was real. None of it had to be invented. It all simply happened, quietly, behind a cartoon that an entire generation trusted. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously, and the deeper anyone goes, the more these buried things start to pile up. Because a hidden voice is one kind of secret. A whole hidden person is another kind entirely. There is a character on this show that almost everyone thinks they know by name, a face that appeared in hundreds of episodes, who turned out, in the show's own story, to be a complete stranger living under a dead man's life. The town found out. They were shocked. And then, in a move even stranger than the lie itself, everyone agreed to pretend it never happened. Section 2. The name nobody was allowed to say. By 1997, Principal Seymour Skinner had been part of The Simpsons for nearly 9 years. People felt like they knew him. He was the stiff, rule-loving man who ran Springfield Elementary School, the grown-up who was always trying and failing to control Bart. The show had slowly filled in his life over the years. He was a soldier who had served in the Vietnam War and still carried the memory of it. He lived with his sharp-tongued mother, Agnes, who treated him like a child even though he was a middle-aged man. He had a slow, careful romance with the teacher Edna Krabappel. He had a history, a family, a personality, and almost 10 years of small moments that fans had watched build up. Skinner was not a main character, but he was a familiar face in hundreds of episodes, as solid and trusted as the school building itself. Then, in the second episode of season 9, the show took all of that and pulled it apart in a single half hour. The episode is called The Principal and the Pauper. It aired on September 28, 1997, and it was the 180th episode of the series. It was written by Ken Keeler and directed by Stephen Dean Moore, and it brought in a famous guest actor, Martin Sheen, to play a brand new character. The story begins in a way that feels warm and ordinary. The town is throwing Principal Skinner a surprise party to celebrate 20 years of running the school. Everyone is there. The mood is happy. It is the kind of gentle, feel-good setup that the show had done many times before. Then a stranger walks in. The stranger is a man no one recognizes, and he says something that stops the whole party cold. He announces that he is the real Seymour Skinner. He says the man everyone has been celebrating, the principal they have known for 20 years, is not Seymour Skinner at all. And right there, in front of the entire town, the principal does not argue. He breaks down and admits it. He confesses that he has been living a lie for 2 decades. His real name, he says, is Armin Tamzarian. What follows is the strangest backstory the show had ever handed to one of its characters. Armin Tamzarian, the man everyone called Skinner, explains who he truly was. As a young man, Armin had been a troublemaker with no family and no direction. He got into trouble with the law after a petty crime, and a judge gave him a hard choice between going to jail or joining the army. Armin chose the army, and that choice sent him to the Vietnam War. In the war, Armin met a sergeant named Seymour Skinner. The real Skinner became his teacher and his hero. He helped Armin grow up, gave his life some meaning, and treated him with a kindness Armin had never known. The two grew close. Then their unit was caught in the fighting, and the real Seymour Skinner was believed to have been killed. Armin was crushed. He decided to do one last good thing for the man who had changed his life. He traveled to Springfield to find Skinner's mother and tell her, gently and in person, that her son had died. But when Armin reached the door and met old Agnes Skinner, something unexpected happened. Agnes looked at this young stranger and decided he was her son Seymour, come home from the war. She was so sure and so happy that Armin did not have the heart to break it. He could not bring himself to tell a grieving mother that her boy was gone. So he stayed. He let her keep believing. He moved into the dead man's house, answered to the dead man's name, and slowly stepped into the dead man's whole life. Over the years, the false Skinner became the school principal, settled into the town, and turned into the familiar man everyone in Springfield thought they knew. He had spent 20 years living as someone else, and he had become so good at it that he almost forgot it was not real. The trouble is that the real Seymour Skinner had not actually died. He had survived the war, been captured, and spent long years held far from home before finally getting free and making his way back. And now, here he was, standing in the middle of a surprise party, ready to take back the life that had been quietly stolen from him. At first, the town tries to do the right thing. The fake Skinner, ashamed, leaves Springfield and disappears into the streets of the big city nearby. The real Seymour Skinner steps into his place. He moves into the house, takes over as principal, and tries to be the man the town owes its loyalty to. But the real Skinner Skinner turns out to be cold, rigid, and unpleasant in a way that nobody can warm up to. The whole town slowly realizes they liked the fake one better. They missed Armin. They missed the man they had spent 20 years with, even knowing now that he had been living a lie the entire time. So they go and bring him back. And the way they fix everything is the part that turns this from a sad story into something genuinely unsettling. The town judge, Judge Snyder, makes an official ruling. He declares that the man who had been calling himself Skinner will once again be called Seymour Skinner, that he will return to his job as principal, and, most chilling of all, that from this day forward, no person in Springfield is ever allowed to say the name Armin Tamzarian again, under the threat of punishment. The real Seymour Skinner, the actual man whose life had been taken, is tied up, loaded onto a train, and sent out of town, told never to come back. And just like that, the whole thing is over. The town agrees, all together, to forget. They go back to calling the imposter by the dead man's name. They erase the truth on purpose. The episode ends with everyone smiling, the school back to normal, the lie restored, and the one person telling the truth shipped away into the night. It is hard to overstate how much this episode upset people. For longtime fans, it felt like a betrayal. They had spent almost a decade getting to know Principal Skinner. They had watched his struggles with his mother, his service in the war, his shy love for Edna Krabappel. All of that history, they were now told, belonged to a man who never existed. Many fans and critics point to this episode as the exact moment the show began to lose the magic that had made it great. Watching years of a character you cared about get tossed away in a single twist left a bad taste that some people never got over. There is a deeper reason the episode sits so strangely in the mind, beyond just breaking the rules of the show. At its heart, it is a quietly scary idea wrapped in jokes. A familiar man, someone you see every day, someone you fully trust, could turn out to be a complete stranger, wearing another person's name and another person's whole life. The principal who scolded children, who answered to his mother, who stood at the front of the school for 20 years, was a ghost of sorts, a borrowed identity standing in for a man who was supposed to be dead. The story plays with the fear that the people around us might not be who we think they are, and that we might never know. The real world brushed up against the episode in a couple of odd ways, too. The name Armin Tamzarian was not invented out of thin air. The writer, Ken Keeler, had borrowed it from a real man, an insurance worker who had helped Keeler after a car accident when he moved to Los Angeles. The real Armin Tamzarian had no idea his name had been used on national television until after the episode had already aired. The whole strange tale was also loosely shaped after a very old story about a famous real-life imposter, a man who tried to pass himself off as someone he was not, which is a trick people have apparently been pulling and arguing about for a very long time. The most fitting part of the whole story is what happened to the episode afterward, because the show ended up doing the exact same thing the town did. Springfield agreed to pretend Armin Tamzarian never existed, and over the following years, The Simpsons quietly agreed to pretend this entire episode never happened. The show's creator, Matt Groening, has said plainly that he does not count it as part of the real story of the characters. Later episodes simply ignored it and contradicted it on purpose. New scenes showed Skinner as a young boy growing up with his mother Agnes. Another showed Agnes pregnant with him. Episodes mentioned his birth and his childhood as the true Seymour Skinner, with no street punk and no stolen name anywhere in sight. Bit by bit, the show wrote the twist out of existence, treating it like a bad dream it wanted to wake up from. So the lie inside the story became a kind of lie about the story. The town buried the truth and went back to calling the imposter Skinner. The show buried the episode and went back to pretending Skinner had always simply been Skinner. The name nobody in Springfield was allowed to say became, in a way, an episode nobody on the show wanted to mention. Both the make-believe town and the real people making the cartoon ended up reaching for the same eraser. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That makes two stories now that the show would rather the world forget: a hidden voice and a hidden person, both put there on purpose. But there is another kind of strange buried in The Simpsons, far harder to explain, because nobody seems to have done it on purpose at all. Somewhere in the background of one old episode, on a small sign that flickers past in a fraction of a second, sits a tiny detail that lines up with one of the worst days in modern history. The people who drew it have been asked for years, and their honest answer is that they have no idea how it got there. Section 3. The sign nobody can explain. In 1997, the two towers of the World Trade Center were simply part of the New York skyline. They were the tallest buildings in the city, a proud sight on postcards, the kind of place tourists pointed cameras at and families visited on trips. To the people making The Simpsons, the towers were just a famous, easy to recognize surprise landmark, the perfect spot to set a story about a family from a small town getting lost and frustrated in the big city. Nobody at the show and nobody watching at home thought of those buildings as anything other than ordinary and grand. That is what makes the episode they built there so hard to look at now. The episode is called The City of New York vs. Homer Simpson. It aired on September 21st, 1997 as the first episode of Season 9, the 179th episode of the whole series. It was written by Ian Maxtone Graham, who had grown up in New York and thought it would be funny to drop the Simpson family into a problem every New Yorker knows. It was directed by Jim Reardon. The two men in charge of the show at the time, Bill Oakley and Josh Weinstein, were the ones who decided the family car should end up at the World Trade Center because they wanted a place that absolutely everyone would recognize. The story starts with a familiar headache. Barney, the town drunk, borrows the Simpsons family car. He goes on a long, blurry bender, and when he finally sobers up, he has no memory of where he left it. Weeks pass, then a letter arrives at the Simpson house. The car has been found, far away in New York City. It is sitting in the open plaza right between the two towers of the World Trade Center, buried under a thick stack of parking tickets with a heavy metal clamp locked onto one wheel so it cannot move. The letter warns the family that they have a limited time to come get it and pay the fines, or the car will be destroyed. So the Simpsons travel to New York. Marge and the kids head off to enjoy the sights, riding around the city, seeing the famous places, having the bright tourist day. Homer gets stuck with the worst job of all. He has to stay with the car and wait for a city worker to come and remove the clamp, and that worker only shows up sometime between 9 in the morning and 5 in the evening. So Homer is trapped at the base of the towers for the entire day, growing more and more miserable. He buys a strange snack from a food cart, a thing called a clav kalash, and washes it down with a can of crab juice, and it ruins his stomach. He grumbles, he suffers, he loses his temper. Nearly the whole middle of the episode plays out right there, in the shadow of the two towers. The show went out of its way to make that setting look real. One of the lead artists, David Silverman, actually traveled to Manhattan to study the World Trade Center up close. He looked at the plaza, the shape of the buildings, the colors, the little details of the area around the base, and brought all of it back so the animators could draw it correctly. Because of that careful work, the towers in the episode look solid and true to life, not like a vague cartoon background. The result was something almost no other show had ever made. It was a long, detailed, funny stretch of television built entirely around those two specific buildings, filled with jokes set right at their feet. For almost 4 years, none of that meant anything beyond a good comedy episode. People watched it, laughed at Homer's terrible day, and moved on. The towers in the background were just the towers. Then came the morning of September 11th, 2001. The two towers of the World Trade Center were attacked and destroyed, and thousands of people lost their lives. It became one of the darkest days in modern history, a day burned so deeply into memory that even the date itself, 9/11, turned into a kind of shorthand for the whole tragedy. In an instant, an old, cheerful Simpsons episode became something the show could not put on television anymore. An entire act of light jokes set at the base of the very buildings that had just been destroyed, with thousands of people grieving, was suddenly impossible to air. So the episode was quietly pulled. For around 5 years, television stations stopped showing it in their reruns. It was simply too painful and too raw. Years later, one of the men who had made it pointed out a grim little fact about what they had created. Theirs was very likely the only episode of any television series anywhere that had ever built a whole section of comedy around the World Trade Center. That distinction, which had once been a fun bit of trivia, had turned into something heavy and strange. The episode disappearing for a while makes sad, simple sense. A tragedy happened, and a comedy that brushed up against it got set aside out of respect. That part is easy to understand, but there is one more detail hidden inside the episode, and this detail is the reason people still talk about it in hushed voices, because no one has ever been able to give a clear answer for it. Somewhere in the background of the New York scenes, a small printed sign appears for just a moment. It is the kind of cheap travel ad that hangs around tourist spots, the sort of thing the eye slides right past. The sign is advertising a budget price for visiting the city. It shows the cost as a $sign and the number 9, meant to read as $9 a day. And standing right next to that number 9, drawn into the same little picture, are the two towers of the World Trade Center, rising up side by side. So for a brief flash on screen, the image lines up in a way that no one was supposed to ever notice. The big number 9 sits beside the two tall, straight towers. A 9, and then two upright shapes that look like the number 11. 9/11, the exact date of the attack that would destroy those towers, sitting quietly in the background of an episode that aired almost 4 years before it happened, hidden in a sign about a cheap travel deal. The drawing had been in the episode the whole time. It sat there through years of reruns completely unnoticed. Just a goofy background gag about how cheap a New York trip could be. The number and the towers only became chilling later, once the date had a meaning that nobody in 1997 could have known. After the tragedy, sharp-eyed fans went back, froze the episode on that single frame, and saw the number 9 and the 2 towers lined up like a date, and the strangeness of it spread quickly. When the people who made the show were asked about it, they did not hide or dodge. The man who runs The Simpsons, Al Jean, said plainly that he had no way to explain it. He called it a completely bizarre and strange thing, and admitted he could not account for how that image had ended up looking the way it did. He was not claiming any magic or any secret. He was simply being honest that he found it as odd as everyone else did. The original producer, Bill Oakley, gave the only down-to-earth answer there is. He explained that the price of $9 had been picked for a very plain reason. It was meant to be a funny, almost silly low price for a trip to an expensive city, the kind of cheap deal that sounds like a joke. There was no hidden message and no deeper plan. The number 9 was chosen because it was comically small, and yet, even while saying that, Oakley admitted that the whole thing was eerie, especially because it appeared in the one and only episode ever built around a full act of World Trade Center jokes. So the honest position of the people who made it lands in a quiet, uneasy place. They did not plan it, they cannot fully explain it, and they agree it feels strange. What makes this haunt people is not really the cartoon. It is the way the human mind works. People are built to look for patterns and meanings, to find shapes in clouds and faces and shadows. When something terrible happens, the mind goes searching backward for warnings, for signs that the awful thing was somehow always coming. A number 9 drawn next to 2 towers in an old cartoon is, by any plain reasoning, almost certainly just chance. A show that has made thousands of jokes across thousands of episodes is bound, sooner or later, to land on something that lines up with a real event by pure accident. That is the calm and likely explanation. But knowing the calm explanation does not make the feeling go away. There is a difference between a thing the mind can explain and a thing the mind can let go of, and this image sits in that gap. It is the unsettling sense of an old, harmless, happy piece of childhood looking back at the world with a meaning it was never meant to have. The episode was made to be funny. Reality reached into it years later and turned one tiny corner of it into something that looks like a warning, even though it almost certainly is not one. And the people who drew it have nothing to offer except the truth, which is that they do not know how it happened. The first 2 stories were about things The Simpsons buried on purpose. A famous voice hidden behind a fake name, a character secretly written out of existence. Those were choices made by real people behind closed doors, even if they later regretted them. This third story is a different kind of buried. Nobody planned the number 9 and the towers. Nobody meant for the episode to vanish from television. The world simply changed around an ordinary cartoon, and a tragedy reached back in time and reshaped how an old, innocent thing would forever be seen. The episode was hidden in the end, not because of a secret inside it, but because the real world had grown too heavy for it to carry. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So far, every story here has been completely real and checkable. But there is another kind of Simpsons mystery that does not come from the show at all. It comes from the people who watch it. For more than 10 years, fans have whispered about a lost episode so disturbing it was supposedly destroyed and scrubbed from every record, one that shows something terrible happening to Bart. There is no tape, no script, no proof of any kind, and yet a huge number of people remain convinced that somewhere out there, it is real. Section 4. The episode that does not exist. For most of its life, The Simpsons has been the safest show in the world. It plays in the background of family dinners. It runs in reruns on lazy afternoons. The bright yellow people and the cheerful little town are some of the first cartoons many people ever remember watching. That warmth and that comfort are exactly why one of the strangest stories ever attached to the show works as well as it does. Because the most frightening thing anyone can do to a happy childhood memory is twist it into something rotten. Around the year 2010, a certain kind of scary story was spreading fast across the internet. People would write short, creepy tales and post them online, often pretending the events were true. Many of these stories shared the same shape. They claimed there was a lost or hidden episode of some beloved cartoon, an episode so disturbing that it was never supposed to be seen, locked away, or destroyed by the studio that made it. These made-up online horror stories even earned a nickname. People started calling them creepypastas, which is just a silly word for scary stories that get copied and passed around the internet again and again. And of all the cartoons in the world, The Simpsons was a perfect target, because almost everyone alive had grown up with it. The most famous of these stories is known simply as Dead Bart. The tale is written as if a real person stumbled onto something they were never meant to find. It begins by claiming that the Fox network has a strange habit of not counting all of its Simpsons episodes, leaving the total number a little off, as though a few episodes are being hidden on purpose. The reason, the story says, is a lost episode from the very first season. According to the legend, this episode was written entirely by Matt Groening himself, during a time when he had supposedly started acting quiet, nervous, and dark. Anyone who tried to ask about it, the tale claims, was met with anger and told never to bring it up. The narrator says he first heard whispers of it at an event, where a speaker simply walked off the stage the moment someone asked about the missing episode. The story then describes how the narrator manages to track down a copy of this forbidden episode. He follows a trail to a plain black website with a single download link. He clicks it, the file lands on his computer, and almost at once his computer is hit with a terrible virus that forces him to wipe everything and start over. Before he does, he copies the file onto a disk, and on that disk is the lost episode. As the tale goes, the episode looks rough and unfinished, like very early Simpsons animation that never got cleaned up. The characters seem slightly off. Homer feels angrier than normal. Marge seems sad. Lisa seems nervous. Bart seems to hold a strange, real anger toward his parents. The family boards a plane for a trip, and early on, as the plane is rising into the air, Bart is pulled out through a window and falls to his death. What follows is the part the story lingers on, and it is built to crawl under the skin. The cartoon supposedly begins to change. The bright, simple animation starts to fall apart and turn realistic, almost like a photograph, especially when it shows Bart on the ground. The rest of the family sits and cries, and the crying goes on, growing more painful and more real sounding than any cartoon should be. The drawings blur and stretch and decay into dark, twisted shapes. Near the end, the camera is said to drift across a graveyard, and on the tombstones are the names of guest stars from across the show's history. Each stone carries a death date. Some belong to stars who had already died. Some belong to stars who are still alive, with the date marking the day they would supposedly die in the future. The episode ends, the legend says, in near silence, with handwritten credits and a final image of the family on their couch, all drawn in that same lifeless, realistic style. It is a genuinely effective piece of horror writing, and none of it is real. There is no lost episode. There is no destroyed file. The Simpsons never made a secret episode where Bart dies and the animation rots into something monstrous. The whole thing is a made-up story, written by a person who went by the name K.I. Simpson, and posted online on January 19th, 2010, on a website where people share these kinds of scary tales. The claim about Fox hiding episodes is false. The detail about a secret production code being covered up does not hold together, because the code the story points to belongs to a completely normal, well-known early episode that anyone can watch. Every spooky claim in the story falls apart the moment it is checked, because there is nothing real to check. No tape exists, no script exists, no proof of any kind has ever turned up, because the events the story describes simply never happened. Why then has a made-up story stuck around for more than a decade, repeated and retold and believed by huge numbers of people who really should know better? Part of the answer is in how cleverly the story is built. It does not just describe scary images. It dresses itself up as a hidden truth, complete with a brave narrator, a forbidden file, a dangerous virus, and grown-ups too frightened to talk. That shape makes a person feel like they are being let in on a real secret, and a secret always feels more powerful than a story. The other part of the answer is the choice of target. Taking the most comforting, familiar cartoon in the world and imagining a dark, rotten version of it hidden underneath is a deeply unsettling idea. A generation grew up trusting that bright yellow world, and the story whispers that the trust was misplaced, that something awful was lurking behind the friendly surface the whole time. There is also a thread running through the Dead Bart story that ties it straight back to the real mysteries already covered here. The fake tale leans hard on the idea that the show can somehow see the future. The detail about the gravestones, with future death dates carved into them, is built to tap the exact same nerve as the strange number in the New York episode, the feeling that The Simpsons knows things before they happen. The made-up story even claimed those gravestones named real guest stars who would later die, including, in some versions, the very pop star whose real hidden episode opened this whole video. So the legend borrows the genuine unease around the show, the true buried secrets and the eerie coincidences, and uses it as fuel to make a piece of pure fiction feel real. What turned Dead Bart from just another internet ghost story into something worth talking about is how big it grew, and what the show finally did about it. The story spread so far and lasted so long that the people making The Simpsons could no longer pretend not to notice it, and in 2018, they answered it directly. The opening of a Halloween-themed season premiere included a dark, gloomy sequence built as a clear nod to the Dead Bart legend, a moment of the show winking at its own ghost story, showing a grim version of the family and playing with the very idea the fans had invented. The show reached out and shook hands with the made-up nightmare that had been told about it. The man who runs the show, Al Jean, has also spoken about it plainly, and he has put it exactly where it belongs. He has called the Dead Bart story false, filing it away among the fan tales he describes as intriguing but not true. So the official word from the top of The Simpsons is that the lost episode never existed, while the show itself was happy to play along with the legend for a laugh. A story about an episode that does not exist became real enough that the real show had to respond to it. That is the strange power sitting at the center of this one. The first three mysteries were buried by the show, or buried by history. This fourth mystery was buried into the show from the outside, planted by a fan, grown by thousands of retellings, until it pushed its way back into the real series. A made-up horror story about The Simpsons became part of the actual story of The Simpsons. The line between what the show hid and what fans imagined it hid started to smudge, and Dead Bart is the clearest proof of how thin that line really is. Two kinds of fan legend now sit on the table. There's the kind that invents a whole secret episode, a hidden thing that supposedly exists somewhere out in the dark. The Dead Bart story is that kind, and it has been proven false again and again. But there is a second kind of fan theory that is far harder to swat away, because it does not claim any hidden tape or forbidden file at all. It points only at the episodes everyone has already seen. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This second theory takes the entire show, all the wild adventures, all the impossible luck, all the strange later seasons that drifted so far from how the show began, and it offers one quiet, chilling explanation for every bit of it. It says that none of it has really been happening. It says that one of the most familiar characters on television fell asleep many years ago, was badly hurt, and never truly woke up, and that everything fans have watched since has been unfolding inside the mind of a man trapped in a long and endless dream. Section 5. The Man Who Never Woke Up. By the time The Simpsons had been on the air for a couple of decades, fans had started to notice some genuinely odd things about it. The characters never aged. Bart had been 10 years old for 30 years. Lisa stayed 8. Baby Maggie never learned to walk and talk. Year after year, the world outside the show changed. New gadgets appeared, time clearly moved forward, and yet the family stayed frozen at the exact same ages forever. Fans also noticed that the show itself had changed shape over time. The earliest seasons were fairly grounded and down to earth, full of small, believable family problems. The later seasons grew wilder and more impossible, packed with space trips, world-famous guests, and adventures no normal family could ever have. These were real things people spotted, and one fan came up with a single, eerie idea that tried to explain all of it at once. The idea is this: Homer Simpson has been lying in a coma since 1993, and every episode since then has been a dream inside his sleeping mind. It starts with a real episode. In April of 1993, near the end of the 4th season, the show aired an episode framed around a hospital stay. It begins with an April Fool's prank. Bart shakes up a huge can of Homer's favorite beer until it is ready to burst, and when Homer opens it, the pressure goes off like a small bomb. Homer ends up in the hospital. Then, while he is there, a heavy vending machine tips over and crashes down on top of him, knocking him into a coma. The episode shows Homer drifting in that coma for most of its length. At the very end, he finally wakes up, sits up in his bed, and goes right back to chasing Bart, just like always. The theory takes that ending and quietly turns it inside out. It says Homer never actually woke up. The waking up scene, in this reading, is the very first moment of the dream. From that point on, every single thing the audience has watched, all the laughs and adventures and chaos of the decades that followed, has been happening only inside the head of a man lying still in a hospital bed. The strongest piece of so-called proof comes from a different episode that aired a few months earlier, in October of 1992. In that one, Homer decides decides to stop going to church. He has a wonderful, lazy day at home, but it nearly ends in disaster when a fire breaks out in his house. While all this is going on, Homer has a dream in which he speaks with God. He asks God a simple, huge question. He wants to know the meaning of life. God tells him he will only find out when he dies. Homer complains that he cannot wait that long, and God answers with a question that, for years, meant nothing at all. God asks Homer whether he can wait 6 months. That episode aired in early October of 1992. The hospital episode, with the exploding beer and the falling machine and the coma, aired on the 1st of April in 1993. The gap between the two is almost exactly 6 months. So the theory takes God's quiet little line about 6 months and treats it as a hidden warning. In this telling, God was not joking. He was telling Homer and the audience that in 6 months, Homer's real life would effectively end, replaced by the long dream that the rest of the series has supposedly been. From there, the theory claims to explain everything that puzzled fans. The reason the children never age, it says, is that Homer remembers them at the ages they were when he fell asleep, 10 and 8 and 1, so his dreaming mind keeps them frozen at exactly those ages forever. The reason the show grew so wild and impossible after 1993 is that a dreaming mind is not bound by real rules, so Homer dreams himself flying into outer space. He dreams of meeting an endless parade of famous people. He dreams of his boss capturing a legendary monster, of becoming a star again and again, of having every kind of grand adventure, all while somehow still keeping his same old job at the power plant. The money worries that filled the early, realistic seasons mostly fade away, because in a dream, a person can simply stop worrying about the rent. Some people who tell the theory even push the sleeping moment back a little further, to an earlier episode where Homer believes he has eaten poison fish and may have only hours to live. But the most popular version points to that April day in 1993, and to the 6-month line that seems to point straight at it. None of this is what truly happens in the show. Within the actual story of The Simpsons, Homer woke up. The coma was a single episode, the machine was a gag, and everything after it is meant to be really happening to a really awake family. The 6-month line was a small joke in an episode about religion, not a secret message planted for the future. The whole coma idea is a way of reading the show from the outside, a clever new lens to look through, not a hidden truth the writers buried inside it. It is fan imagination at its most creative, taking real episodes and real lines and stitching them into a story the show never meant to tell. The theory first appeared on the website Reddit, posted by a user who went by the name Hard to Pick a Name. From there, it spread across the internet like a fire, getting written up, argued over, and shared again and again, until it became one of the most famous fan theories the show has ever produced. Part of why it caught on so fast is that it does something a simple ghost story cannot. It does not just try to scare anyone. It offers one neat answer to a whole pile of real questions that thoughtful fans had genuinely been asking, and a single answer that explains everything is always tempting, even when it is made up. There is a sadness sitting underneath this theory that is very different from the cold horror of the lost episode legends. The Dead Bart story was built to disturb, with rotting animation and a dead child. This one is quieter and lonelier. It asks the audience to imagine that a character millions of people love is actually lying broken and silent in a hospital bed, that he never got up, that his family long ago stopped being able to reach him. Under that idea, every joke and every happy ending of the last 30 years becomes the gentle dream of a dying man, a kind man building himself a brighter, funnier world because the real one slipped away from him on an ordinary spring afternoon. That heavy, tender feeling is what makes the theory linger. It does not jump out and frighten, it settles in slowly and stays. And like the lost episode legend before it, this theory tugs on the same nerve that the real mysteries do. The strange feeling that the show can see ahead in time. The 6-month line lands like a prophecy, a warning slipped into an old episode that only makes sense in light of what came later. The difference, of course, is that fans built this prophecy themselves, out of 2 real episodes that happened to line up by accident. The show did not plan it. People found it and gave it meaning, exactly the way they had found meaning in the strange number from the New York episode. The pattern keeps repeating. A generation that grew up loving the brightest show on television keeps discovering ways to read shadows into it. When asked about all this, the people who actually make The Simpsons gave a clear answer. Al Jean, the man who runs the show, said flatly that the coma theory is false. He pointed out how absurd the idea really is when you look at it from the writer's side. For the theory to be true, the team working in 1993 would have had to assume the show was going to keep running for many years more, and then, right before some of them moved on, secretly plant a hidden trick for all the future writers who would come after them without telling anyone. That is not how the show was made, and in dismissing it, Al Jean placed the coma theory in the very very same spot he placed the lost episode legend. He said it belongs with the dead Bart story, in what he jokingly called the file of fan ideas that are intriguing but simply not true. Years later, the show went a step further and played with the theory right on screen, the same way it had played with the lost episode legend. In a more recent episode built around a string of fake, silly, deleted scenes, the writers tucked in a moment that directly poked at the Homer coma dream idea, letting the show wink at the fans who had spent years insisting Homer was still asleep. So once again, a made-up fan theory grew so large that the real series reached back out and answered it, half denying it and half having fun with it. Two fan-made stories now sit beside the real mysteries. One invented a hidden episode that never existed. The other invented a hidden meaning behind episodes everyone had seen. Both were proven false. Both were built to feel like the show could reach into the future or hide a terrible secret. And both grew so powerful that the actual people behind The Simpsons had to step in and say, plainly, that they were not real. But not every prophecy attached to this show falls apart under a close look. Fans built the 6-month coma warning out of pieces, connecting dots that were never meant to connect. The lost episode gravestones that supposedly predicted deaths were pure fiction, written to spook people. Those were stories people told about the show. There is, however, a whole different set of moments that are not stories at all. Moments that anyone can pull up and watch for themselves, where the cartoon was drawn and written years, sometimes decades, before the real world caught up to it. And then the real world did exactly that. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. One of those moments involves a single throwaway line about who would one day run the country. The line was written down at the turn of the century, long before it could have made any sense. And when it finally came true, the writer who put it there admitted out loud that he had meant it as a warning all along. Section 6. The warning that came true. By the year 2000, The Simpsons had been on the air for more than a decade and had told well over 200 stories. Across all those episodes, the writers had made thousands upon thousands of jokes. Some of those jokes looked backward at history. Some poked fun at the present. And every so often, the show would imagine the future. The way comedy often does, dreaming up silly pictures of what the world might look like years down the road. Most of those future jokes were exactly that, just jokes. Here for a laugh and gone in a second. But a small handful of them did something that no one could have planned. They came true. And the reason these moments matter, far more than any lost episode legend or coma theory, is that no one has to take anyone's word for them. Anyone can pull up the actual episode and watch the future sitting there in plain sight, drawn years before it arrived. The most famous of these moments lives in an episode from the 11th season called Bart to the Future. It first aired on March 19th in the year 2000. The story uses a familiar trick. Bart is given a peek at what his life will look like many years ahead. In this glimpse of the future, Bart has grown up into a bit of a mess, while his little sister Lisa has gone on to do something remarkable. Lisa has become the President of the United States. The show proudly calls her the country's first straight female president, and shows her sitting in charge, dealing with the heavy problems of running the nation. In one short scene, President Lisa is in a meeting with her staff, talking about the state of the country. Almost in passing, as a quick setup for a joke, she mentions that her new government has inherited a real mess. She says they have been handed a serious money problem left behind by the person who held the job before her, and she names that person directly. She says they inherited the budget crunch from President Trump. Her staff confirms that the country is flat broke. The whole thing lasts only a few seconds. It is a throwaway line tossed off as background for a story about Lisa, a small joke buried inside a cartoon about a girl growing up to lead the country. 16 years later, in 2016, Donald Trump was elected President of the United States in real life. A line written as a quick gag in a cartoon years before it could have meant anything serious had named the future leader of the country. The show had reached forward across 16 years and landed on the exact person in the exact job. When the election results came in, people remembered that old episode, dug it up, froze it on that one frame, and were stunned to see it plainly there. The clip spread everywhere, and the show's reputation as some kind of fortune teller grew larger than it had ever been. The writer of that episode was a man named Dan Greeny, and when he was asked about it, he gave an answer that made the moment even stranger. He explained that the Trump line had been put there on purpose, as a kind of warning to the country. In his mind, a Trump presidency had seemed like the logical last stop on a path toward things going badly, a fitting punchline for a story about a nation drifting toward trouble. So the line was not a random name pulled pulled from a hat. It was a deliberate joke with a point behind it. A writer using the show to say something he believed about where the country might be heading. And then, years later, the thing he had written as a worst-case joke walked right into the real world. None of this means the show can truly see the future, and being honest about that matters, especially for a story that claims to be built only on solid facts. At the time the episode was made, Donald Trump was already a famous public figure who had actually been making a real run at the presidency under a smaller political party. So the writers were partly reacting to something that was genuinely in the news, picking a well-known name that was already floating around the idea of running. On top of that, a show that fires off thousands of jokes over decades is bound, by simple chance, to occasionally hit a real target. Throw enough darts and a few will land. That is the calm, grounded way to look at it. And yet, even with all of that fully admitted, the moment refuses to feel ordinary. The show did not just vaguely joke that someday a strange person might run the country. It named the exact man, placed him in the exact office, framed it as a warning, and did so 16 years early. The writer himself meant it as a caution about the future, and the future obeyed. That mix of a real on-purpose warning and a real on-the-nose result is what keeps people staring at this one. It sits in a space the mind cannot fully settle, somewhere between coincidence and something that feels, against all reason, like foresight. After the election made the old line famous, the show did something that showed it knew exactly what had happened. In a later episode, the opening gag featured Bart at the chalkboard, writing the same sentence over and over as punishment, the way he always does. The line he wrote that day was a quiet joke about the whole situation. He wrote, again and again, that being right is no fun at all. The show was winking at its own strange power, half proud and half uneasy about having called it so far in advance. There is even a final recent twist to the Trump story that sounds made up, but is real. Dan Greeny, the very writer who put the fake president line into the show all those years ago, has himself stepped toward the real job. He launched his own run for President of the United States. The man who once wrote a quick joke about who would lead the country grew up, in a sense, to chase the office for real, which adds one more loop to a story already full of them. A second example sits right beside the Trump one, and in some ways it is even harder to shrug off, because it came true in the most literal way possible. The episode is called When You Dish Upon a Star, and it aired on November 8th, 1998. The main story is a goofy one about Homer becoming a personal helper for a pair of movie stars who have moved to the small town to escape fame. Late in the episode, a film director is shown pitching a movie idea, which he has stolen from Homer, over at the famous Fox movie studio. And as the scene shows the front of that studio, there is a sign on the building. The sign says that the studio, 20th Century Fox, is a division of the Walt Disney Company. At the time, that sign was pure nonsense, and that was the joke. Fox and Disney were two giant, separate, rival companies. The Simpsons itself aired on Fox. The idea that Fox could secretly belong to Disney was as silly as the idea that one rival sports team secretly owned another. It was a quick background gag, the kind of throwaway joke the show slipped into the corners of scenes all the time, there for the sharp-eyed viewer to catch and chuckle at. 19 years later, on December 14th, 2017, the joke stopped being a joke. Disney announced that it was buying a massive chunk of the company that owned 20th Century Fox in a deal worth tens of billions of dollars. The studio that made the movies, and a great deal more, was passing into Disney's hands. Among everything Disney was buying was the home of The Simpsons itself. The throwaway sign from 1998 had become a plain statement of fact. Fox really had become a part of the Walt Disney Company, just as the cartoon had jokingly claimed almost 2 decades earlier. One of the writers from that era, a man named Mike Scully, later explained how the gag came about, and his answer makes the whole thing feel even more pointed. He said it had started as a simple need for a funny sign behind that studio scene. The joke drew partly on the fact that Disney had recently bought another big company a couple of years before, so the idea of Disney swallowing up rivals was already in the air. But he also admitted there was a second layer to it. The writers had jokingly figured that, given enough time, they would all probably end up working for Disney someday anyway. So the sign was a wink about their own future. The people making the show guessed where they might end up, drew it as a gag, and then watched the real world prove them right. The show that lived its whole life on Fox is now owned by Disney, exactly as that little sign once teased. Why do these two moments grip people so much harder than the lost episode legends or the coma coma theory? The answer is simple. The fan-made stories crumble the instant anyone checks them because there is nothing real underneath. These two predictions do the opposite. They get stronger the more closely a person looks, because the proof is right there in episodes that aired and have never been hidden. A made-up tale asks for trust. A real frame asks only for a pause button. And there is something deep in the human mind that thrills at the idea that the future might be knowable, that someone or something out there can see the shape of what is coming. These moments tease that idea with hard, checkable evidence, which is far more powerful than any ghost story. Part of what makes the show's fortune teller reputation so sticky is the way it loops back into everything else covered here. The fake gravestones in the Lost episode legend, the 6-month warning in the coma theory, the eerie number in the New York episode, all of them lean on this same feeling that the show can see ahead. And the reason that feeling seems believable at all is because of real hits like Trump and Disney. A handful of genuine, provable predictions gave the made-up ones room to grow. The true moments built the show's strange reputation, and the false ones borrowed it. A generation that grew up on The Simpsons now treats the show, half jokingly and half seriously, like a crystal ball. Every time something big happens in the world, people race online to ask whether the cartoon called it first. And honesty matters here because that habit has a dark side. Most of the time, the answer is no. A large number of the images shared online claiming the show predicted some disaster are fake, changed on a computer, or stretched so far they barely connect to anything real. The show did not see most of what it gets credit for. The Trump line and the Disney sign stand out precisely because they are the rare cases that survive a careful look. The ones where the real frame matches the real event, with no trickery needed. They are the genuine articles in a sea of fakes, and that is exactly why they deserve a careful, honest telling, rather than a wild one. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Both of those predictions can still be reasoned away as lucky coincidence if a person wants to, but there is one buried in the show that cannot be, because it is far too exact to be an accident. It involves the show's dumbest character standing at a blackboard, scribbling an answer to one of the hardest questions in science, an answer the smartest people on the planet would not confirm for years, and one that someone put there on purpose. Section 7. The answer on the blackboard. The predictions from the last story can be argued away by anyone who wants to. A famous name already in the news, a business guess that was not hard to see coming, both can be filed under luck and quietly forgotten. There is one moment hidden inside The Simpsons, though, that holds up no matter how hard a person pushes on it, because it is far too exact to be chance and far too tangled to be a happy accident. The strangest part of it is who it belongs to. The math genius at the heart of this story is Homer Simpson, the laziest and least book-smart character the show ever made. A man whose deepest love is donuts and whose brain mostly seems to run on beer and naps. The episode is called The Wizard of Evergreen Terrace, and it aired on September 20th, 1998, near the start of the 10th season. The idea behind it came from Dan Greaney, the same writer who would later drop that famous line about a future president, and the script went to John Swartzwelder to actually write. The story is a sad and funny one. Homer wakes up one day and realizes that his life is half over, and that he has not really done anything worth remembering. He sinks into a gloomy mood. To pull himself out of it, he latches onto a new hero, the great American inventor Thomas Edison, and decides he will become an inventor too. Homer throws himself into it completely. He quits his job at the power plant. He fills the house with strange contraptions. He builds a shotgun that fires makeup onto a person's face. He makes an electric hammer that swings wildly out of control. He invents an alarm that shouts that everything is fine and cannot be switched off. He even builds a reclining chair with a toilet built right into it. Most of his inventions are useless or dangerous, and his family is not impressed. The only one they like is a simple chair with 2 extra legs hinged onto the back so that it can never tip over backward. Then Homer spots a poster of his hero and notices to his horror that Edison had built the very same chair long ago, which sends Homer off on a jealous quest to prove that the great man stole his thunder. In the middle of all this, the show needs to make Homer look, for once, like a true inventor hard at work. So one scene shows him standing in front of a large blackboard, covered from edge to edge in long, complicated lines of math, scribbling away like a genius lost in deep thought. To a normal viewer, it is a quick gag. The whole joke is that simple, foolish Homer is suddenly surrounded by brilliant, serious equations, the kind of thing a real scientist might cover a board with. Most people watching laughed and moved on without giving the writing on the board a second thought, but the writing on that board was not random scribbling. Years later, a British science writer named Simon Singh sat down to study the math hidden across The Simpsons for a book he was writing about it, a book he would call The Simpsons and Their Mathematical Secrets. When he looked closely at Homer's blackboard, board, he found something that stopped him cold. One of the equations on it, when a person actually works through it, turns into a guess. And the guess is an answer to one of the biggest and hardest questions in all of science. The question is about a tiny piece of matter, a particle so small it cannot be seen, that scientists had spent decades chasing. This particle is so important that some people gave it the grand nickname of the God particle, because it helps explain one of the deepest mysteries of all, the reason that anything in the universe has weight at all. Without it, nothing would hold together the way it does. Scientists first dreamed up the idea that this particle might exist back in 1964, and they ended up naming it after one of the men who imagined it, a quiet researcher named Peter Higgs. Then they spent the next several decades trying to prove the thing was actually real, with no luck for the longest time. The hunt for it became one of the most famous and most frustrating searches in the whole history of science, a goal that the brightest minds in the world chased and chased without ever quite reaching it. Finding it turned out to be one of the hardest things humans have ever tried to do. To hunt for something that small, scientists from many different countries had to join together and build one of the largest and most expensive machines ever made, a giant ring buried deep underground, big enough to stretch for miles. They used that machine to smash tiny bits of matter together at almost unthinkable speeds, hoping to catch a glimpse of the particle hiding inside the wreckage. The whole effort cost a staggering amount of money and took the work of thousands of brilliant people. Finally, in 2012, after all those years and all that struggle, they succeeded. They confirmed that the particle was real, and they carefully measured how heavy it was. The news raced around the world and was treated as one of the great achievements of the century, the end of a search that had lasted longer than most of the searchers had been alive. Here is what makes Homer's blackboard so hard to explain away. The equation he scribbled back in 1998 works out to a guess for how heavy that very particle should be, and his cartoon guess, written 14 years before the real answer was found, lands in roughly the same neighborhood as the number the scientists eventually measured with their enormous machine. Homer's figure was not a perfect match. It came out several times higher than the true weight, so no one should pretend it was exactly right. But for a number scribbled on a blackboard, in a comedy, more than a decade before the real discovery, it was startlingly close. Far closer than any random scribble could ever be by chance. Simon Singh, the man who found it, judged it a genuinely good guess, especially coming from a so-called amateur inventor like Homer. The reason the guess pointed anywhere real at all is that it had been built out of true things. Whoever wrote it had stitched the equation together from real, measured facts about how the universe works, the actual speed of light, the strength of gravity, the kind of solid numbers that scientists lean on every single day. A guess built from real ingredients was always going to land far closer to a real answer than one pulled out of thin air. The reason this moment cannot be filed under luck, the way the last two predictions could, comes down to a single fact. The brilliant answer on Homer's board did not appear by magic, and the show did not stumble onto it by accident. Someone put it there on purpose, and that someone knew exactly what they were doing. The writer behind that blackboard was a man named David Cohen. Before he ever worked in television comedy, Cohen had studied at some of the finest universities in the world, with a deep training in physics and the kind of advanced math that most people never go near. He was, in plain terms, a genuine brain, who happened to end up writing jokes for a cartoon. He would later go on to help run another beloved animated show of his own, a science fiction comedy stuffed with even more hidden math and science. When the scene called for a blackboard full of impressive genius math, Cohen did not fake it with squiggles and nonsense. He sat down and built real equations, the kind that actually mean something. He even reached out to a friend of his, a scientist who studied the stars and distant galaxies at a major university, to help make sure the math on the board was sound and clever. So the picture comes into focus. The dumbest character on television was shown writing the work of one of the smartest people in the writer's room. The genius scribbles on Homer's board were the real thoughts of a real, highly trained mind, hidden behind the face of a man who cannot spell and forgets his own children's names. And because that mind knew real science, the answer it tucked onto the board happened to land near a truth that the greatest scientists alive would not nail down for over a decade. This was no one-time trick either. For a long stretch of its life, The Simpsons has quietly been written, in part, by people with serious training in math and science. Several of its writers hold high degrees from top universities in subjects most viewers would find dizzying, and they have spent years taking joy in slipping real, difficult ideas into the background of a silly cartoon. They did it for their own fun, and for the tiny handful of sharp-eyed viewers who might ever notice. This habit runs so deep that fans and teachers have spent years freezing the show frame by frame, hunting through the blackboards and signs and scraps of of paper in the background, collecting the real math the writers buried there like treasure waiting to be dug up. That same blackboard in Homer's house held more than just the famous particle equation. It also hid a second joke, this one aimed squarely at people who love math. The writers had placed a string of numbers on the board that looked, at a quick glance, like they had cracked one of the most famous puzzles in the history of mathematics, a problem that had stumped the greatest minds on Earth for more than 300 years. Simon Singh was the perfect person to catch it, because his very first book, written years before, had been all about that exact centuries-old puzzle. So the instant a hint of it flickered past on a cartoon blackboard, his eyes locked onto it. The numbers were a sly trick, a near miss built so cleverly that a person checking them on a simple calculator might believe, for a moment, that the impossible puzzle had been solved right there in a cartoon. It had not. The writers had simply hidden a brilliant inside joke where almost no one would ever look, just to amuse themselves. The science writer who uncovered all of this came away with a bold claim, and he meant it seriously. He said that The Simpsons is the most mathematical television show ever to air in prime time in the entire history of the medium. A show about a yellow family and a clumsy dad, watched by hundreds of millions of people as light entertainment, has spent decades quietly carrying some of the most advanced ideas and human knowledge in its margins, drawn into chalkboards and signs and quick background shots that almost everyone overlooks. That fact reshapes the whole mystery of the show seeing the future. The Trump moment and the Disney sign made the cartoon look like a fortune teller, like something with a strange power to peer ahead in time. This blackboard does something different, and in a way, more satisfying. It pulls back the curtain. The show does not glimpse the future through magic. It is made by some of the cleverest people working in television, a few of them trained scientists, and when a clever, trained mind fills a blackboard with real math, that math is going to brush up against real truths about the world. What looks from the outside like fortune telling is, on the inside, simply brilliance hiding in plain sight, doing its work where no one ever bothers to look. It also explains why so many of the show's other strange hits feel believable. Once a person learns that real geniuses have been quietly steering the writing for years, the idea that the show might land near a real discovery or name a real future leader stops sounding like luck and starts sounding like the natural result of very smart people having a little fun with their work. The hidden minds behind the cartoon are the engine behind its reputation. They put smart things into the background, and now and then those smart things turn out to match the real world in ways that look almost impossible to the rest of us, even though the plain truth behind it is just clever people doing clever work. There is a perfect joke buried in all of this, and the writers surely knew it. They chose their very stupidest character to carry their very smartest secret. They could have put that blackboard of genius math behind Lisa, the clever one, or behind some serious scientist guest. Instead, they handed it to Homer, a man who once forgot how to sit down, and let him stand there looking like the greatest mind of the age. The gap between how the world sees the cartoon and what is really tucked inside it was the whole point, and the people making it were quietly laughing at that gap the entire time. So the dumbest man on television turned out to be the proof of the sharpest secret the show keeps. Behind Homer's blank stare and lazy grin sit some of the finest minds in the business, slipping real science and real math into a world that most people treat as harmless background noise. The answer on the blackboard was real. The man who wrote it was real. Most viewers will never pause to read a single number on that board, and that, in a way, is exactly how the writers always wanted it. A small, private joke hidden in plain view. And the brilliance hiding inside the silliest show on Earth is the realest thing of all. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The same brilliant writers who hid genius in plain sight were also capable of something far colder. There is one episode fans return to again and again, not because it is funny, but because it is the darkest thing the show ever made on purpose. The story of a decent, hard-working man who walked into Homer's world by accident and did not walk back out. The writer who ended him felt no guilt about it at all, and said so plainly. Section 8. The Man Who Did Everything Right. The Simpsons runs on a strange rule that the show almost never says out loud. Homer Simpson is lazy, he is reckless, he is not smart, and he barely tries at anything. And yet his life is wonderful. He has a loving wife, 3 healthy children, a comfortable house, and a steady job he is somehow never fired from, no matter how badly he does it. Across the years, he has flown into space, met presidents and rock stars, won prizes, and lived through 100 adventures that would break a normal person. And he has come out the other side every time without a scratch. The show almost never stops to ask how any of this is fair. It simply lets Homer float through his charmed life. life. Just once, though, the writers decided to test that rule. They dropped a real, normal, hard-working man into Homer's world, and they watched what the rules of Springfield would do to him. The episode is called Homer's Enemy, and it aired on May 4th, 1997, near the end of the show's finest stretch of years. It was written by John Swartzwelder, from an idea pitched by one of the men in charge, Bill Oakley. The new man it introduces is named Frank Grimes, though Homer quickly starts calling him Grimy, a nickname Grimes never wanted. Frank Grimes had lived one of the hardest lives imaginable. The show lays it out plainly. He was abandoned by his family at the age of 4. He never went to school. As a child, he worked as a delivery boy, carrying presents to children from rich and loving homes, children who had everything he did not. On his 18th birthday, he was caught in an explosion that badly hurt him. He had to teach himself everything he knew, and he had to fight and claw for every single thing he ever earned. He was the opposite of Homer in every way that mattered. Where Homer drifted, Grimes struggled. Where Homer was handed luck, Grimes was handed pain. The writers built Grimes on purpose to be the one truly realistic person in the whole show. A normal human being with normal limits and normal hopes, set down in the middle of a town where cartoon logic rules and nobody else seems to notice it. He alone reacts to Springfield the way a real person actually would, and that is the engine of the whole tragedy. The very thing that makes him seem sane to our eyes is the thing that marks him for doom in his. Grimes comes to Springfield because of his hard work. The town's cruel old rich man, Mr. Burns, happens to see a news story praising Grimes as a model of grit, a man who pulled himself up from nothing through pure effort. Impressed for once, Burns gives him a job at the nuclear power plant, and so the hardest working man in town is placed at a desk right beside the laziest. What Grimes sees there slowly drives him out of his mind. He watches Homer sleep on the job. He watches Homer eat instead of work, ignore every safety rule, and make mistake after mistake without a care. Then he learns the rest. This careless fool goes home each night to a warm house and a family who adores him. This man has been to outer space. This man has met famous people and done remarkable things, all while being, by any honest measure, terrible at everything. To Grimes, it makes no sense at all. A man who does everything wrong has been given everything. A man who did everything right, who suffered and worked and never quit, has almost nothing to show for it. The unfairness of it eats at Grimes until he can no longer hold it in. He decides that Homer is everything wrong with the world, and he declares Homer his enemy. In his own mind, Grimes came to see Homer as everything that had gone wrong with the country, a living symbol of a man rewarded for laziness while better people went unseen. And here lies the saddest mistake Grimes ever made. He aimed every drop of his anger at one man, at Homer, when the real unfairness was far larger than any single person. The whole world around him was tilted, crushing him and quietly carrying Homer along. Yet Grimes never questioned that bigger picture. He simply blamed the cheerful fool in front of him, and that narrow, burning focus was part of what destroyed him in the end. Homer, for his part, does not even understand what is happening. Homer likes nearly everyone, and he is genuinely hurt and confused that this new man cannot stand him, so he does what he thinks is the kind thing. He tries to make friends. He invites Grimes over for dinner, hoping to win him over. The visit does the opposite. Sitting in Homer's big, comfortable home, surrounded by a loving family, Grimes only sees more sharply how much Homer has and how little he himself was ever given. He goes back to his own tiny, bare apartment angrier than before. Each new day at the plant chipped away at him a little more. He could not understand how no one else in Springfield seemed to even see the problem. The other workers shrugged at Homer's blunders. The bosses let them slide. The whole town had simply agreed, long ago and without ever saying so, that Homer was to be loved no matter what he did. Grimes was the only one who refused to join that quiet agreement, and standing alone against it slowly hollowed him out. The cruelest part is that Homer's kindness keeps wounding Grimes without anyone meaning it to. At one point, Grimes leaps in to save Homer from a terrible accident at the plant, knocking away something dangerous before it can hurt him. But the way it plays out, Homer ends up telling their boss that Grimes was the one causing trouble, and Grimes is the one who gets blamed and punished for the very act that saved Homer's life. Again and again, just by being near Homer, Grimes loses. Every good intention from Homer somehow lands on Grimes as another blow. Finally, Grimes decides he will make the whole town see what he sees. He is sure that if people could just watch closely, they would understand that Homer is a fool who does not deserve his charmed life. So Grimes tricks Homer into entering a contest to build a model of a power plant. What Homer does not know, and what Grimes does know, is that the contest is meant for small children. Homer builds a silly, childish model, exactly the kind of thing a little kid would make. Grimes brings him to the presentation in front of a crowd, certain that this will be the moment the truth comes out. It does not come out. The crowd takes one look at Homer's childish model and falls in love with it. They cheer, they laugh with delight, and Homer wins first prize. The one moment Grimes was certain would finally expose Homer turns into yet another win for the man, with the whole town clapping for him. For Grimes, it was the final proof that the world was broken beyond repair. He had handed everyone the clearest possible chance to see the truth, and they had cheered the fool instead. That is the moment Frank Grimes breaks. Something inside him snaps completely. If the world is going to reward Homer for being a careless fool, then Grimes will become a careless fool too. He begins to stalk through the plant, mockingly acting like Homer, grabbing at things he should never touch, throwing every rule aside, loudly announcing that he is Homer Simpson and does not need to be careful about anything. Then he seizes a pair of powerful electric wires with his bare hands, the kind of reckless act that only a charmed man like Homer could ever walk away from. Grimes is not charmed. The shock kills him on the spot. The town gathers for his funeral, and even in death, Frank Grimes cannot win. As the minister stands over the grave and speaks, Homer, who has fallen asleep during the service, mumbles something silly out loud in his sleep. The whole crowd bursts into warm laughter. At the funeral of the one man who saw through him, every eye turns back to Homer, charming and beloved as always, while Grimes is lowered into the ground and forgotten. The episode ends with everyone laughing, the joke still resting on the dead man. There is a reason so many people call this the darkest thing the show has ever done. Frank Grimes is, in many ways, the most real and relatable character The Simpsons ever created. He believed in a simple, hopeful promise, the one most people are raised on, that if a person works hard and does the right thing, the world will treat them fairly in return. The episode takes that gentle belief and smashes it against a world that does not run on fairness at all. And the deepest horror of it is that Homer is not a villain. He never schemes against Grimes. He never wishes him harm. He only ever tries, clumsily, to be friendly. The cruelty is not in Homer himself. It lives in the rules of the world around him, a world that showers a lucky fool with everything and grinds an honest, decent man into the dirt for no fair reason at all. That is a genuinely frightening idea to slip into a comedy. The quiet suggestion that effort and goodness might guarantee a person nothing. The episode also quietly flips the usual shape of comedy on its head. Normally, in stories like this one, the audience is meant to side with the easygoing, fun-loving slob against the stiff, uptight rule follower who needs to lighten up. The carefree one is the hero, and the serious one is the joke. Here the show takes that familiar setup and turns it inside out. The serious, careful man becomes the one to care about, the one to mourn, and the lovable slob becomes, without ever meaning to, the thing that ends him. The man who wrote it felt no guilt about the ending whatsoever, and he said so years later in a rare interview. When it was pointed out to him that the episode ended on a bleak note with very little warmth or comfort, John Swartzwelder shrugged it off entirely. In his view, Grimes had been asking for it the whole time. Grimes refused to accept Homer the easy way everyone else in town accepts him, and so, the writer felt, he brought his fate down on his own head. To Swartzwelder, the lesson was not a kind one. The world of the show belongs to Homer, and anyone foolish enough to fight that truth is doomed to lose. He once described writing Homer as being a bit like writing for a cheerful dog who lives entirely in the moment, which helps explain why Homer drifts through disaster without a care, while a thinking, worrying man like Grimes is dragged under by the very same world. The writers did understand how heavy all of this was, and they handled it carefully. Running alongside the grim main story is a light, goofy little side plot in which Bart buys a broken down old factory at an auction for a single $1 and spends the episode playing at being a big important boss with his friend. That silly subplot was added on purpose, as a place for the audience to catch its breath between the dark scenes of Grimes. The people making the show knew exactly how much sadness a comedy could carry, and they built in a release valve so the weight would not crush the whole thing. When it first aired, the episode split people right down the middle, and it still does. Some fans and critics point to it as the moment the show began to lose its warmth, a turn towards something colder and meaner. Others call it one of the bravest and greatest episodes the series ever produced, precisely because it dared to be so honest and so bleak. The show's own creator has named it among his personal favorites. One major magazine once ranked it among the very best episodes the show had ever made, and to this day it holds one of the highest fan ratings of any episode in the show's entire run. Yet at least one of the show's own writers came to hate it, calling it simply in bad taste, and more than one critic admitted it was painful to sit through. Decades later, people still return to it, not to laugh, but because it leaves them with a strange, heavy feeling that will not quite go away. The character left such a mark that the show later brought him back in monstrous monstrous form, with a rotting, vengeful version of Frank Grimes clawing his way out of his grave to come after Homer in one of the show's Halloween specials, the dead man finally getting his shot at revenge in a nightmare. The same group of brilliant writers who quietly hid genius math on a blackboard, the answers to questions that would take the world's scientists years to solve, also chose to hide this. Inside the friendliest cartoon in the world, behind the bright colors and the silly laughs, they buried one of the darkest and truest ideas a person can be handed: that the world is not fair, that hard work is no promise of anything, and that sometimes the good and careful people lose while the lucky fools sail on. That single idea, tucked quietly into a half hour of silly jokes, is heavier than almost anything the show ever dared to say out loud, and it is a big part of why the episode refuses to fade. The show has a brilliant side and a cold side, and both of them live in the very same room. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. For all its darkness though, the show kept coming back to one strange habit: the habit of looking ahead. And there is one more of those forward glances worth examining, an episode made back in the 1990s that dared to picture a year still long out of reach. In it, the show quietly drew small gadgets that looked like harmless toys at the time and look now like the very phones and watches in nearly everyone's pocket. How much of that was truly seeing ahead and how much was something far simpler is a question worth sitting with. Section 9. A postcard from the future. Of all the times The Simpsons tried to imagine the future, one attempt stands above the rest, both for how much people love it and for how closely it has been studied ever since. It was the very first time the show ever set a story in the future, and it reached 15 years ahead, all the way to the far-off year of 2010. In a small, strange coincidence, it first aired on the 19th of March, the very same day of the year that the famous future episode with the line about a President Trump would air 5 years later. The show was at the height of its powers, and it used that power to paint a picture of a world that had not arrived yet. The episode is called Lisa's Wedding, and it aired on March 19th, 1995 in the 6th season. The way it begins is gentle and a little magical. The family is wandering through a fair, the kind with jousting and costumes, when Lisa stops at a fortune teller's booth. Lisa, being the smart and doubtful one, does not believe in any of it, but the fortune teller wins her over by naming every member of the family and saying exactly what each of them is doing at that very moment, right down to Homer heckling a puppet show across the fairground. Convinced, Lisa sits down and the fortune teller begins to tell her the story of her first true love, a story set years in the future. In that future, the year 2010, Lisa is 23 years old and away at a fine college. There she meets a charming young Englishman named Hugh, a polished, clever man with a soft accent, brought to life by the actor Mandy Patinkin. The two fall deeply in love, and before long, Hugh asks Lisa to marry him. The trouble, as the fortune teller's tale unfolds, is that Hugh cannot stand Lisa's loud, messy, embarrassing family. He looks down on them, and he has no real interest in accepting them as his own. In the end, Lisa realizes she cannot marry a man who will not love the people she comes from, and she lets him go. The whole story is told to her as a gentle warning, a glimpse of heartbreak waiting somewhere up ahead, before she finds the happiness that is truly hers. Part of the fun of the episode is the quick peek it gives at where everyone else ends up. In this future, Bart has grown into a rough, twice-divorced man who knocks down buildings for a living. Milhouse, Bart's nervous childhood friend, has somehow become Homer's boss at the power plant, while Homer himself is still parked at the exact same desk he always had. Maggie has grown into a teenager who never once gets to finish a sentence, always cut off the moment she opens her mouth. Even the city's blowhard mayor turns up driving a cab. These little jokes were never meant as serious guesses. They were just the writers having fun imagining their characters 15 years older. Looking at those grown-up versions now, with real years piled on top of them, gives even the jokes a faint sadness, because the far-off future the show was teasing has quietly slipped into the past, while the real characters never aged a single day. The clock moved for us, not them. That sweet, sad little love story is the heart of the episode. The episode is widely counted among the very best the show ever made, and it marked a turning point as the first time the series ever dared to leap into the future at all. People came back to it again and again, partly for that tender story, and partly for the bittersweet feeling of seeing beloved characters grown older and changed. But what people remember most, and what they argue about to this day, is the world the show drew in the background of it. As the tale plays out in this imagined 2010, the writers and artists filled the edges of every scene with small, futuristic gadgets, drawn purely as guesses about what life might look like 15 years on. The most famous of them sits on Hugh's wrist. When one of his attempts to propose goes sideways, Hugh lifts his arm and speaks into a little device strapped to his wrist, a watch that works like a telephone. To anyone watching in 1995, it looked like a goofy, far-fetched far-fetched toy. To anyone watching now, it looks almost exactly like the smartwatches that millions of people wear every single day. The little screens on the wrist that take calls and answer questions when spoken to. The gadgets did not stop there. When Lisa wants to share her big engagement news with her mother, she does it through a video call. She speaks to Marge and sees her mother's face on a screen at the same time. Exactly the way people talk to each other across the world today. The cartoon version comes with a funny twist that shows its age, because to start the call, the caller still has to spin an old-fashioned round dial, the kind of thing real phones had back in the 1990s. So the show landed on the idea of seeing a face while you talk, years before it was common, while still imagining the clunky old way of dialing it up. Scattered through the rest of the episode are other guesses too, like learning done from far away, through screens and gadgets that talk back when spoken to. Some of the show's guesses were pure silliness, like turning the famous London clock tower into a giant digital clock blinking the wrong time. Those were never meant to come true, and they did not. There is one guess in the episode, though, that has nothing to do with gadgets, and it is the hardest of all to wave away. In a wide shot of the city of London, the show drew the skyline of the future, and standing in it is a brand new building that did not exist anywhere in 1995. It is tall, narrow, and pointed, a sharp tower of glass rising high above everything around it. Years later, a real building went up in London that looks remarkably like the one the cartoon had drawn, a slim, spiky glass spire that opened to the public in 2012, the very same year that scientists confirmed that tiny particle from the blackboard. A specific new building, sketched into a cartoon skyline more than 15 years before the real one was finished. That kind of guess is far harder to explain than a talking watch. Unlike a watch or a video call, a single specific building is not an old dream that everyone shared. Nobody had been imagining that exact glass spire for generations. The show simply drew a tall, sharp tower into a future London, and years later a tall, sharp tower of almost the same shape rose in roughly the right spot. That is the one piece of this episode that still gives careful people pause. The episode even managed to predict its own future, in a small way. In this glimpse of 2010, future Lisa is shown to have become a vegetarian, a person who does not eat meat. At the time it was just a quick character note, but not long after, in a later season, the show made that note come true, for real, turning Lisa into a lifelong vegetarian in an episode that featured the voice of a world-famous former member of the Beatles. The show had written down a small fact about where a character was headed, and then went and made it real with its own hands. Now comes the honest part, the part that separates a careful telling of all this from a silly one. The talking watch and the video call feel like pure magic, like the show reached forward in time and copied the gadgets out of the future. The truth is calmer than that. The show did not invent either of those things, and they were not even fresh ideas in 1995. The dream of a watch that talks and a telephone that shows a face had been floating around the world for a very long time before this episode aired. Comic strip heroes wore talking wrist radios many decades earlier. Spies in old movies were always tapping at clever gadget watches. One famous comic strip detective had been speaking into a two-way radio on his wrist as far back as the 1940s, more than 50 years before this episode ever aired. Telephones that let people see each other had been a standard idea of the future in books and films for generations. So the show did not pull these gadgets out of nowhere. It reached for dreams that the whole culture had been sharing for years and simply drew them into a cartoon. The honest truth is that these were clever, fun, well-aimed guesses, built on ideas everyone already half expected, far more than they were any real act of seeing the future. Real watches like the ones on people's wrists today did not even become common until around the middle of the next decade, many years after 2010 had already come and gone, which means that even the show's timing on its most famous gadget was a little bit off. Even with all of that fully admitted, the episode still lands strangely when watched today, and there is a reason for that. It is not any single gadget. It is the sheer number of things it got close to all at once, and it is the year itself. The show imagined 2010, and 2010 is now many years in the past. So watching the episode now means watching an old show made in the past, picturing a future that has already come and gone. The silly props it drew as background jokes sit in real pockets and on real wrists today. That collision, a past looking forward at a future that is now also the past, gives the whole thing an uneasy, dreamlike feeling, even when the plain explanation behind it is perfectly ordinary, and the human mind, faced with that feeling, will almost always reach for the magic answer over the dull one. This is a big part of why the clips from this one episode get shared online over and over, usually with a caption swearing that the show saw it all coming. People want the world to be readable. They want to believe that somewhere, someone or something can peer around the corner of time and tell us what is waiting there. A cartoon that seems to have done exactly that, drawn 15 15 years early is far more thrilling than a plain story about a few writers making good guesses out of ideas that were already floating in the air. This episode is the right place to be honest about the show's whole reputation as a fortune teller, because it shows all the different shapes that reputation really takes. A few of the show's predictions are the real thing, solid and checkable, like the line naming a future president, the sign about the company takeover, and the genius math hidden on a blackboard. A handful of others, like the watch and the video call, are clever guesses built on dreams the whole world already shared, close enough to feel spooky but not truly out of reach. And a great many of the so-called predictions that fly around the internet are not predictions at all. They are pictures changed on a computer, fakes built on purpose to fool people, stitched onto the show's good name because the real hits made the fakes easy to believe. Some of the most widely shared of these fakes claim the show had foreseen a deadly disease spreading across the world or the sudden death of a famous athlete. In both cases, the images people passed around had been quietly changed on a computer or lifted from somewhere else entirely, dressed up to look like old Simpsons scenes that never actually aired. They fooled millions of people, precisely because the show's real predictions had trained everyone to expect the impossible from it. The careful, honest way to look at the show is to keep these piles separate. The genuine, checkable moments, like a specific building drawn before it was built, deserve real wonder. The lucky guesses deserve a smile and a shrug, and the fakes deserve nothing at all but a careful eye. The reason the show ever earned its strange, magical name is that a small number of its forward glances truly did come true in ways that are hard to shake. Everything else, the guesses and the hoaxes alike, grew up around those few real moments the way a tall tale grows around a single true story, until the whole thing turned into a legend far bigger than the handful of facts at its heart. And a legend, once it grows large enough, stops caring what is true. It feeds on the wonder and not the proof. The show became a kind of mirror that people hold up to every new event, sure they will find that it knew all along, and often finding it whether the proof is really there or not. So the picture of Lisa's wedding turns out to be the perfect window into all of it. A tender little story about a girl, a fortune teller, and a love that was not meant to be, wrapped in a world of gadgets that were partly real guesses, partly old dreams, and partly just for laughs. The show looked ahead, the way it always loved to do, and it landed somewhere between clever and uncanny, which is exactly the place this show has always lived. It is funny and frightening at the same time, ordinary and impossible in the same breath. A children's cartoon that somehow keeps brushing up against the real world in ways no children's cartoon ever should. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That place, somewhere between clever and uncanny, is where every story in this video has lived. A hidden voice behind a fake name, a stolen life and a name nobody was allowed to speak, a strange number that lined up with a terrible day, a lost episode that never existed, and a dreaming man who never woke, a blackboard full of secret genius, a funeral where the wrong man was mourned, and a future drawn before it arrived. They are all so different, and yet they all belong to the same bright, silly cartoon. Why one cheerful show about a yellow family ended up holding so many buried, eerie, and frightening things, and what that says about the show and about everyone who ever grew up trusting it, is the question worth sitting with as all of these threads are finally drawn together. Section 10. Why it is always The Simpsons. After all of this, after the hidden voice and the stolen name, the eerie number and the lost episode, the dreaming man and the secret genius, the lonely funeral and the future drawn too early, one question is left standing above all the others. Why this show? Out of every program ever made, every cartoon, every comedy, every drama, why is it always The Simpsons that ends up at the center of these strange and buried stories? Why does one cheerful show about a yellow family hold more secrets, more eerie coincidences, and more quiet horrors than almost anything else on television? The answer is not a single thing. It is several things stacked on top of one another, and together they explain how one friendly cartoon became the most haunted show in the world. And the answer says as much about the people watching as it does about the cartoon itself. The buried things themselves come in different kinds, and sorting them is the first step to understanding the whole. Some of them were hidden by the show on purpose, and later half regretted. The most famous singer alive, slipping into one episode behind a fake name, belongs in that pile. So does the strange twist that turned a beloved principal into a stranger living under a dead man's name. A twist the show found so uncomfortable that it quietly pretended the whole thing had never happened. These were choices made by real people that the show later wished it could take back. One of those choices has now vanished almost completely. The episode with the secret superstar voice was pulled from every screen years later, after dark truths about that singer came to light, until it became nearly impossible impossible to watch in any honest, legal way. And the forbidden name from the principal twist was, inside the story itself, banned out loud. The whole town ordered never to speak it again. The show buried these things twice over, once when it made them, and once when it tried to erase them. Other buried things were not hidden by the show at all. They were buried by the world. A bright, funny episode set at the base of two famous towers was made with no dark meaning whatsoever. And then a terrible day arrived and turned that innocent half hour into something no one could bear to watch. The show did not change. Reality changed around it and reached back to bury something that had been perfectly harmless when it was made. For about 5 years, that episode quietly disappeared from the reruns, and the strangest part of it was a tiny background sign that only ever meant anything after the fact. A number and two towers that lined up, by some accident no one has ever explained, with the very date of the disaster. Then there is a third pile, the things that fans buried into the show from the outside. A nightmare of a lost episode that never existed. A theory that a sleeping man has been dreaming the whole series from a hospital bed. Neither of those was ever real, yet both grew so large and so loud that the show itself had to reach out and answer them, half denying them and half playing along. The lost episode nightmare had a real author and a real birthday, posted online by a single person back in 2010, and the show grew so aware of it that years later it slipped a wink at the legend into one of its own Halloween openings. The dreaming man theory got an answer straight from the man who runs the show, who filed it away, plainly, among the fan ideas that are intriguing but simply not true. People dug holes in the show and filled them with their own inventions, and the inventions took on a life of their own. There is the show's hidden cleverness too, the genius math scribbled on a blackboard by writers who were secretly some of the smartest people in television. The number on that blackboard came within shouting distance of an answer the world scientists would not confirm for 14 more years, and it had been placed there on purpose by a writer trained in real science. And there is the small handful of real, checkable moments where the show guessed at the future and got it right. The line about a president, the sign about a company, all of it surrounded by lucky guesses and outright fakes that borrowed its good name. And finally, there is the show's hidden darkness, the cold, brave episode where a good and honest man walked into a fool's lucky world and was crushed by it, lowered into the ground while the crowd laughed at the fool who outlived him. Brilliance and cruelty hidden in the same show, sometimes only an episode apart. So many different kinds of strange, all living inside one cartoon. The first reason they gathered there is the simplest one of all, and it is size. The Simpsons is not just any show. It has been on the air for more than 30 years, the longest-running cartoon in American history, and one of the longest-running shows of any kind ever made. More than 700 episodes have aired across more than 35 years, an amount so vast that no one has likely ever held all of it in their head at once. Inside those episodes are uncountable jokes, background signs, throwaway lines, and tiny details drawn into the corners of scenes. No other show has ever produced so much, and the more of something there is, the more chances it has to brush up against the real world. A show that makes 100 guesses about the future will get a few right by luck alone. A show that fills thousands of backgrounds with little jokes will, sooner or later, draw something that happens to line up with a real event. A show that runs for decades will gather behind-the-scenes secrets the way an old house gathers dust. Thousands of people have worked on it over the years, writers and artists and actors and guests, each one bringing their own choices and accidents and quiet stories. A project that large, running that long, simply cannot help but collect the odd, the hidden, and the strange. The sheer, staggering amount of The Simpsons is the soil that all these stories grew out of. The second reason is the people who made it. The writers of the show were not ordinary comedy writers. A number of them came from the worlds of real science and real mathematics, trained at the finest schools, brilliant in ways that had nothing to do with telling jokes. Several of them held advanced degrees in mathematics and the sciences from places like Harvard, the kind of training most comedy writers never go anywhere near. They took quiet joy in hiding clever, difficult, real things in the background of a silly cartoon, just for their own amusement and for the rare, sharp-eyed viewer who might one day notice. When minds like that fill a show with hidden cleverness for 30 years, some of that cleverness is bound to land near real truths about the world. A cartoon written partly by geniuses is going to look, now and then, like like it knows more than a cartoon should, because in a strange way, it does. The third reason runs deeper than size or cleverness, and it is the one that gives all these stories their real power. The Simpsons is the most familiar show in the world. For a huge part of everyone alive today, it was simply always there, playing in the background of childhood, as safe and warm and ordinary as a favorite blanket. That deep, easy trust is exactly what makes the buried things feel so unsettling. A dark secret hidden inside a stranger is just a curiosity. A dark secret hidden inside something a person loved as a small child is something else entirely. The chill does not really come from the show itself. It comes from the gap between how safe the cartoon felt and what turns out to be tucked away beneath it. The brighter and more trusted the surface, the more unsettling it is to find something buried underneath. It is the difference between hearing a strange noise in an empty warehouse and hearing that same noise in your own childhood bedroom. The setting is what makes the chill. The fourth and final reason lives not in the show at all, but in the people watching it. The human mind is built to hunt for patterns, to find faces and shadows and meaning in coincidence, and it does this most eagerly with the things it knows best. A show that millions of people have watched 100 times over becomes a perfect screen to throw those patterns onto. Every time something big or frightening happens in the world, people race back to this familiar cartoon, certain that somewhere in its thousands of hours it must have seen the thing coming. And because the show is so huge, they can almost always find something that seems to fit, whether it truly fits or not. The Simpsons did not really make itself into a fortune teller. People made it one, because people have always needed something that seems to know what is coming. That hunger is so strong that people have shared fakes by the millions, pictures changed on a computer, swearing the cartoon foresaw disasters it never once touched. The need to believe came first, and the proof was bent to fit it. Put all four reasons together, and the mystery of why it is always this show begins to dissolve into something almost ordinary. A show this enormous, made by minds this sharp, trusted this deeply, and watched this closely, was always going to become a magnet for the strange. The buried voices and the eerie numbers and the lost episode nightmares were not placed there by fate. They gathered there the way driftwood gathers on the biggest beach, simply because it was the biggest beach of all. Plenty of other shows have run for a long time. Plenty have been clever. Plenty have been loved. But almost none have been all of those things at once and for this long and this widely. The Simpsons is the rare place where great age, real brilliance, deep childhood trust, and a reach into nearly every home on Earth all overlap in a single show. Take away any one of those, and the strange stories would never have piled up the way they did. It is the meeting of all four in one cartoon that made it the magnet it became. In people's minds, these different kinds of strange do not stay neatly in their separate piles. They blur together into one big feeling. The real hits make the fakes easy to swallow. The hidden brilliance makes every coincidence feel planned. The genuine darkness makes the made-up nightmares feel possible. And the deep childhood trust makes every bit of it land harder than it should. One by one, they stop being a list of separate oddities and become a single, powerful sense that this show is somehow more than a show, that it knows things, hides things, and sees things. None of that is quite true, and all of it feels true, which is perhaps the most haunting thing of all. There is even a comfort buried in it, strange as that sounds. A world that can be read, even a frightening one, feels safer than a world that means nothing at all. If a cartoon can quietly hold the shape of things to come, then maybe the future is not as blind and random as it feels. That is part of why the legend refuses to die. It is not only that people fear what the show might have seen, it is that, somewhere beneath the fear, they almost hope it really can see. Because a world that watches back is less lonely than one that does not. And yet, knowing all of that does not quite take the strangeness away, and maybe it should not. The real lesson hiding in all these stories is gentler and stranger than any single mystery. The line between a silly children's cartoon and a deep, eerie mirror of the world was always far thinner than anyone noticed. The brightest, friendliest things often carry the most hidden weight. A show built simply to make children laugh turned out to be a kind of record of everything. Genius and cruelty, accident and design, the true and the made up, the comforting and the quietly terrifying, all sitting together in one small yellow world. It was never only a cartoon. It was a mirror that a whole generation grew up gazing into without ever realizing how much was looking back. Looked at long enough, the show stops feeling like a comedy and starts feeling like an attic, a place where decades of jokes and accidents and secrets have been quietly stacked, waiting for anyone curious enough to climb up and look. And what is found up there is never only about a cartoon family. It is about the strange, hopeful, frightened way people make meaning out of the things they love, filling the corners of a yellow world with their own wonder and their own dread, until the show and the people watching it can no longer be fully told apart. That is perhaps the most fitting truth of all. The things buried in The Simpsons are, in the end, the very things buried in everyone who ever watched it. The hopes and the fears, the wish to see the future and the dread of what it holds, the love of a bright, safe world, and the quiet knowledge that nothing safe stays simple forever. The show became a place to keep all of that, hidden in plain sight, behind a face that never once stopped smiling. Here the journey finally comes to rest, though the truth is that it could go on. There are more buried things in this show than any one video could ever hold. More secrets, more strange coincidences, more whispered stories waiting in the dark corners of more than 30 years of television. They will still be there tomorrow and the day after that, patient as ever, half hidden behind the bright yellow faces that have kept the whole world company for so long. But the ones gathered here are enough to make the point. A simple cartoon about a clumsy father and his troublemaking son turned out to be one of the strangest, deepest, most quietly haunted things ever made for a screen. It hid a king behind a fake name. It buried a man under a borrowed life. It drew a number that matched a terrible day, and a tower that had not yet been built. It carried genius and cruelty side by side, and it slowly became a mirror for a whole world's hopes and fears without ever once seeming to try. None of it was magic. All of it was real, or honestly examined, or carefully set apart from the fakes. And perhaps that is the most comforting thought of all to drift off on. The strangest stories are not always the made-up ones. Sometimes they are simply the true ones, sitting quietly inside the things we loved all along, waiting for a calm night and a curious mind to come and find them. For now, though, the lights of Springfield can dim, and its secrets can keep until another night. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.